There was a time when my name lived gently on his tongue, not rushed, not shortened, not forgotten between obligations. He used to say it the way children do, like it was a place he could return to. A safe sound, a certainty. Back then, love didn't need reminders. I remember the mornings when the house would wake before the sun, his small footsteps racing down the hallway, the soft thud of his weight climbing onto my bed. He would press his face into my shoulder and breathe, as if checking that I was still there. I always was. Motherhood arrived in my life without instructions, but with a kind of knowing that settled deep in my bones. I learned his hunger before he asked, his sadness before he spoke, his fears before he understood them himself. I didn't just raise him, I held him through becoming. There were years when the world felt heavy on his back, when he failed tests, lost friends, questioned himself. I watched him retreat into silence, and I learned how to sit with him there without pushing, without fixing, just present. That presence became our language. As he grew older, I taught myself how to loosen my grip, to love without holding too tight, to let him walk ahead, even when every instinct told me to protect. I believed love was meant to stretch, to expand, to make room for more people, not replace the old ones. When he moved out, I cried alone and smiled in front of him. I told him I was proud, that he was ready, that he didn't need me the way he used to, and that it was okay. And I meant it. What I didn't know was that distance doesn't always come as space. Sometimes it comes as change, a shift in tone, a pause before replying, a warmth that cools without explanation. At first, it was subtle. Calls that ended sooner, conversations that stayed on the surface, updates that came late or not at all. I told myself I was imagining it, that this was normal, that children grow and mothers must learn to watch from afar. But love knows when something is off. There were moments when I felt him pulling away, not dramatically, not angrily, but carefully, like someone loosening their fingers from a grip they no longer need. I didn't ask questions. I didn't demand answers, because mothers are taught that loving quietly is a virtue. I still believed there was room for me, that I would always be part of his world, even if not at the center. I didn't realize then that I wasn't being pushed out. I was being phased out, slowly, politely, without a single goodbye. And that kind of disappearance is the hardest to name because no one ever admits it's happening. When presence became optional, I began noticing the change in the smallest ways. Not the kind people warn you about. Not fights, not arguments, not slammed doors, just your absence. He still answered when I called, but no longer with ease. There was a pause before his hello, as if he were deciding how much of himself he could afford to give me. His voice sounded thinner, stretched between responsibilities that didn't include my feelings. "How are you?" I asked once. "I'm good," he said. And before I could respond, he added, "We're busy right now, we." That word arrived quietly and settled between us like a line drawn on the floor. I stood on one side, unsure when I'd crossed it. He started sharing his life in summaries instead of stories. I stopped hearing about his worries, his doubts, the things that once pulled him toward me. Now I received updates the way distant relatives do, brief, efficient, complete. I told myself this was maturity. That independence looks like detachment if you don't understand it. But I understood more than I wanted to admit when I visited. I noticed how carefully I chose where to sit, how I waited to be offered tea instead of making it myself, how I asked before opening cabinets I once filled with groceries meant just for him. The house no longer recognized me. The walls held laughter I hadn't heard. The fridge carried leftovers from dinners I wasn't invited to. There were photographs, new ones framed carefully, capturing moments I didn't know existed. I smiled at them. I always smiled. Because I didn't want to be the mother who clings, the mother who competes, the mother people talk about in lowered voices. So I learned how to shrink. I asked fewer questions. I offered advice only when asked. I waited to be included instead of assuming I belonged. One evening, I suggested we go for a walk, just the two of us. Something simple. He hesitated. Just a breath. Just a flicker of calculation. I'll see, he said. I'll see, not yes. Not no, not even later. That hesitation echoed louder than rejection ever could. I nodded and changed the subject, pretending not to feel the shift beneath my feet. But something inside me recognized that moment for what it was. I was no longer automatic. I was optional that night. Alone in my quiet house, I replayed our conversation again and again. I searched for the exact place where I might have gone wrong. The moment when love became something I needed permission to access. Had I loved too much? Held on too long? Failed to step back soon enough? Mothers are taught to blame themselves first. I reminded myself that this was natural. That sons grow. That lives expand. That priorities shift. Still, I miss the way he used to lean into my presence instead of away from it. I miss being someone he turned to, not just someone he checked in with. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being close enough to see what you're losing, but not close enough to stop it. I didn't confront him. I waited, because waiting felt safer than asking questions I might not survive the answers to. And somewhere in that waiting, I began to understand something painful and true. You don't always lose people because they walk away. Sometimes, they just stop walking toward you. The first time I realized love had learned new rules, it wasn't during a disagreement. It was during a celebration, a birthday his. I had planned it the way I always did in my heart. Even if the details were no longer mine to decide. I bought a gift I thought he'd like, wrapped it carefully, practiced what I would say when I saw him. Nothing dramatic, just warmth, just us. When I arrived, the room was already full. Laughter bounced off the walls, music played softly. People hugged him, toasted him, shared stories I hadn't heard. I stood there, smiling, holding my gift like a permission slip. He greeted me kindly, respectfully, briefly, and then he turned back to the room. I told myself not to read into it. I found a seat. I watched. I learned where I fit now, slightly to the side, just outside the circle of easy conversation. She moved through the room with confidence. She knew where everything was, who needed what, when to speak and when to laugh. People listened to her the way they used to. Listened to me without realizing it was happening. At one point, I caught my son's eye. For a second, I saw something familiar there. A flicker of recognition, of history. But it passed later. As the night wound down, I handed him my gift. He thanked me, hugged me, a polite hug, a careful one, the kind that ends before it settles. "Thank you for coming," he said. Coming, not being here, not of course, just coming. On the drive home, the words replayed in my head. I tried to tell myself they didn't matter, that language changes, that people don't always mean what they say, but love remembers patterns over time. I noticed how often decisions were explained to me instead of discussed with me, how plans were shared only after they were finalized, how my opinions were received kindly but no longer weighed. Once I offered a suggestion, something small, something practical. He listened, nodded, and said, "We already decided. We already decided." It wasn't the decision that hurt. It was the certainty that I hadn't been part of the deciding. I began to understand that love had boundaries now, invisible ones, lines I couldn't see until I crossed them. I didn't know where those lines were drawn or who had drawn them, but I felt their presence in every careful step I took. So I adjusted. I asked before speaking. I waited to be invited. I learned how to be agreeable, because nothing teaches you restraint like the fear of becoming unwanted. There were nights I lay awake wondering when love had started requiring qualifications, when being his mother stopped being enough on its own. I remembered a time when my presence calmed him, when my voice anchored him, when my advice mattered not because it was perfect, but because it came from me. Now, love felt conditional, not cruel, just selective. And the hardest part wasn't losing influence. It was losing intimacy. Because influence can be replaced, intimacy cannot. I didn't resent her. I didn't resent him. I resented the quiet way the rules changed without my consent. The way I was expected to adapt without grieving, to understand without explanation, to love without being loved the same way back. That's when I realized something I wasn't ready to admit yet. I wasn't being edged out by conflict. I was being edged out by normalcy. And normalcy is the hardest thing to argue with because everyone insists it's reasonable. There is a strange moment in loss that no one prepares you for. It's the moment you realize you're still present, but no longer positioned. I noticed it the first time I reached for something familiar and hesitated. We were in his home, the kitchen, a place that once felt like an extension of my hands. I moved toward the kettle without thinking, the way I had for years. Then I stopped. I looked around, unsure. I waited. She noticed. "Oh, I've got it," she said gently, already reaching for it. Her tone was kind, her smile polite, and just like that, the habit I had built over decades disappeared. I stepped back. That became my role, stepping back. I began to observe instead of participate, to listen instead of contribute, to hold my thoughts until I was sure they were welcome. There were conversations where I felt my voice rising, a story forming on my lips, only to fade as the moment passed. The space I once filled had learned to exist without me. It wasn't hostility. It wasn't rejection. It was replacement by routine. They had their rhythms now, their private jokes, their shorthand, the way they communicated with glances and half-finished sentences. I recognized it instantly. It was the same language he and I once spoke. I wondered if he noticed how easily it had transferred. Once, during dinner, I laughed at something he said. A real laugh, the kind that comes from knowing someone deeply. He looked surprised, as if he had forgotten that I still understood him. That moment stayed with me longer than it should have. I started to feel like a guest in a life I had helped build. Someone welcomed but not expected, included but not essential. When I left, no one asked if I had arrived home safely. When days passed without calls, no one checked in. And I told myself it was fine, because mothers are taught to be grateful for scraps of presence, to celebrate being remembered at all. But there is a particular pain in realizing that the space she once occupied hasn't been left empty. It's been filled, not with malice, not with intention, just naturally. I found myself rehearsing conversations in my head before they ever happened, deciding what version of myself was least disruptive. The quiet one, the agreeable one, the understanding one. I chose all three. Now, love felt conditional, not cruel, just selective. And the hardest part wasn't losing influence. It was losing intimacy. Because influence can be replaced, intimacy cannot. I didn't resent her. I didn't resent him. I resented the quiet way the rules changed without my consent. The way I was expected to adapt without grieving, to understand without explanation, to love without being loved the same way back. That's when I realized something I wasn't ready to admit yet. I wasn't being edged out by conflict. I was being edged out by normalcy. And normalcy is the hardest thing to argue with because everyone insists it's reasonable. There is a strange moment in loss that no one prepares you for. It's the moment you realize you're still present, but no longer positioned. I noticed it the first time I reached for something familiar and hesitated. We were in his home, the kitchen, a place that once felt like an extension of my hands. I moved toward the kettle without thinking, the way I had for years. Then I stopped. I looked around, unsure. I waited. She noticed. "Oh, I've got it," she said gently, already reaching for it. Her tone was kind, her smile polite, and just like that, the habit I had built over decades disappeared. I stepped back. That became my role, stepping back. I began to observe instead of participate, to listen instead of contribute, to hold my thoughts until I was sure they were welcome. There were conversations where I felt my voice rising, a story forming on my lips, only to fade as the moment passed. The space I once filled had learned to exist without me. It wasn't hostility. It wasn't rejection. It was replacement by routine. They had their rhythms now, their private jokes, their shorthand, the way they communicated with glances and half-finished sentences. I recognized it instantly. It was the same language he and I once spoke. I wondered if he noticed how easily it had transferred. Once, during dinner, I laughed at something he said. A real laugh, the kind that comes from knowing someone deeply. He looked surprised, as if he had forgotten that I still understood him. That moment stayed with me longer than it should have. I started to feel like a guest in a life I had helped build. Someone welcomed but not expected, included but not essential. When I left, no one asked if I had arrived home safely. When days passed without calls, no one checked in. And I told myself it was fine, because mothers are taught to be grateful for scraps of presents, to celebrate being remembered at all. But there is a particular pain in realizing that the space she once occupied hasn't been left empty. It's been filled, not with malice, not with intention, just naturally. I found myself rehearsing conversations in my head before they ever happened, deciding what version of myself was least disruptive. The quiet one, the agreeable one, the understanding one. I chose all three, because somewhere along the way, love taught me that taking up space was risky, that being too present could cost me what little access I have left. So I learned how to stand in the margins of my own story, close enough to witness, too far to participate. And the hardest part was this: no one told me to move. I just slowly realized there was no room left where I used to stand. There came a point when I understood that speaking was a risk, not because my words were cruel, not because my intentions were wrong, but because honesty had started to feel inconvenient. I noticed it every time I almost said something real and stopped myself. Every time I softened a sentence before it left my mouth. Every time I chose comfort over truth. Once, I mentioned how long it had been since we'd spent time alone together. I didn't accuse. I didn't complain. I said it the way you share a memory lightly, almost casually. He shifted, not away from me, but away from the conversation. "Things are different now," he said. "You have to understand that." I nodded. Of course I did. Understanding had become my responsibility. After that, I learned to read the room before I spoke, to sense when my presence was welcome and when it was merely tolerated. I paid attention to body language, tone, timing. I waited for the right moment, but the right moment never came. So I began storing my feelings instead, folding them neatly inside myself like letters I would never send. I didn't talk about the missed calls, the unanswered messages, the invitations that stopped coming. I told myself that silence was maturity, that restraint was respect. But silence has a way of growing teeth. It eats at you slowly, quietly, until one day you realize how much of yourself you've swallowed just to keep the peace. There were moments when I wanted to remind him of who we used to be, of the bond that didn't require scheduling or permission, of the years when I was his first call, not an afterthought. But every time I imagined bringing it up, I pictured the outcome, the sigh, the defensiveness, the phrase I had come to fear most. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." So I said nothing, because when someone treats your pain like a complication, you start to wonder if you're allowed to feel it at all. I began measuring my worth by how little I disrupted his life, how easy I was to accommodate, how quietly I could exist in the background. That's when I noticed something frightening. I was disappearing from myself. I stopped sharing opinions, stopped laughing as loudly, stopped expecting anything. I told myself this was love, that loving someone means letting them go. But letting go shouldn't feel like erasing yourself. There is a difference between releasing and retreating. And I had retreated so far that even I wasn't sure where I ended anymore. One night, alone in my living room, I tried to remember the last time I had spoken freely without editing, without fear. I couldn't. That's when it hit me. It had only protected everyone else's comfort. It's a strange kind of pain watching someone you love live a full life. I didn't find out about things the way I used to. It came late, casually, often by accident. A comment from someone else. I learned about trips after they returned. Decisions after they were already settled into place. It's okay. But knowing had never been about control. Once, a neighbor congratulated me on something I hadn't heard yet. I smiled, nodded, pretended I already knew. I went home and sat in the quiet, replaying the moment until the truth settled in. I wasn't part of the conversation anymore. I had become someone others updated if they remembered. I noticed how my phone felt heavier in my hand at night, how I checked it without thinking, hoping for a message that wasn't coming. Not because I expected one, but because hope is stubborn, even when it hurts. I began lowering my expectations as a form of self-protection. If I expected nothing, I couldn't be disappointed. If I stayed small, I couldn't be pushed out. But shrinking doesn't stop the ache, it only makes it quieter. There were days when I caught myself rehearsing what I would say if he called, as if the call itself were inevitable, as if I needed to be ready, pleasant, calm, undemanding. I practiced being easy to love. And then there were days when I didn't rehearse at all, when the silence felt normal enough to accept. That scared me more than the loneliness ever had. Because when absence becomes routine, you stop questioning it. I remembered a time when I could sense his moods without words, when his joy lifted me and his sadness kept me awake. That closeness didn't fade overnight, it dissolved. And dissolving leaves no clear edge to hold onto. No one could point to a moment and say, "This is when it happened," not even me. I wondered if he noticed the distance the way I did. If he ever thought about calling and then decided it wasn't necessary. If my absence registered at all or if it felt natural. Like growing out of clothes you no longer need. That thought stayed with me longer than I wanted it to, because it suggested something unbearable. That my presence had become optional not just in practice, but in meaning. And yet, I kept loving him. Quietly, patiently. From a distance he never asked for, but never tried to close. I realized then that love doesn't always leave when it's no longer nurtured. Sometimes it stays just far enough away to survive. Silence hadn't protected the relationship, and I had mistaken that comfort for peace. While you slowly become a footnote in it, news no longer arrived with excitement or urgency. A photo online, a passing mention that made my chest tighten before I could prepare for it. Celebrations after the cake had been cut. And every time, I told myself the same thing. You don't need to know everything. It had been about connection. Once, a neighbor congratulated me on something I hadn't heard yet. I smiled, nodded, pretended I already knew. I went home and sat in the quiet, replaying the moment until the truth settled in. I wasn't part of the conversation anymore. I had become someone others updated if they remembered. I noticed how my phone felt heavier in my hand at night, how I checked it without thinking, hoping for a message that wasn't coming. Not because I expected one, but because hope is stubborn, even when it hurts. I began lowering my expectations as a form of self-protection. If I expected nothing, I couldn't be disappointed. If I stayed small, I couldn't be pushed out. But shrinking doesn't stop the ache. It only makes it quieter. There were days when I caught myself rehearsing what I would say if he called, as if the call itself were inevitable, as if I needed to be ready, pleasant, calm, undemanding. I practiced being easy to love. And then there were days when I didn't rehearse at all, when the silence felt normal enough to accept. That scared me more than the loneliness ever had. Because when absence becomes routine, you stop questioning it. I remembered a time when I could sense his moods without words, when his joy lifted me and his sadness kept me awake. That closeness didn't fade overnight. It dissolved, and dissolving leaves no clear edge to hold onto. No one could point to a moment and say, "This is when it happened." Not even me. I wondered if he noticed the distance the way I did. If he ever thought about calling and then decided it wasn't necessary. If my absence registered at all or if it felt natural. Like growing out of clothes you no longer need. That thought stayed with me longer than I wanted it to, because it suggested something unbearable. That my presence had become optional not just in practice, but in meaning. And yet, I kept loving him. Quietly, patiently. From a distance he never asked for, but never tried to close. I realized then that love doesn't always leave when it's no longer nurtured. Sometimes it stays just far enough away to survive. There is a difference between being loved and being needed. I didn't understand that difference until the day it became painfully clear that I was neither. It happened during a moment that should have been ordinary. Something small. Something simple, the kind of thing I used to do without being asked. He was dealing with a problem. Nothing dramatic, just life being inconvenient. I listened, the way I always had, and then I offered a solution. A gentle one, thoughtful. The kind that comes from years of knowing someone deeply. There was a pause on the line. Then he said, "It's okay. We've got it handled." I felt that word land again, heavier this time. Not because he had someone else to rely on, but because my role in his life had officially expired. I wasn't a resource anymore. I wasn't a comfort. I wasn't even a second option. I was history. After that call, I sat quietly for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't feel angry. I felt unnecessary. And that feeling is hard to explain unless you've lived it. I thought back to the years when he depended on me without hesitation. When my advice wasn't just welcomed, it was sought. When my presence solved things simply by existing. Now, my instinct to help felt outdated, almost inappropriate. I began to notice how often I stopped myself from offering anything at all. Not because I had nothing to give, but because I didn't want to be reminded that it wasn't needed. That's when I started redefining myself. Not as his mother, not as someone essential to his life, but as someone who loved him quietly from the sidelines. I told myself this was growth, that letting go was a sign of strength, that love doesn't demand relevance. But deep down, I knew the truth. Love can survive distance, but dignity struggles when it's no longer acknowledged. I wasn't asking to be central. I wasn't asking to be consulted. I was just asking not to be erased. And yet, erasure doesn't always come with cruelty. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in politeness, in independence, in we've got it covered. That's what hurt the most, because there was nothing to argue with, no injustice to point at, no villain to confront, just the quiet understanding that the chapter of my life where I was needed had ended without ceremony, without warning, without gratitude, and I was expected to accept it with grace. I tried. I really did. But acceptance doesn't erase the ache of becoming optional in the life you once held together. It only teaches you how to carry it silently. Grief is supposed to come after loss, after goodbyes, after endings you can point to. But what do you do when the person you're grieving still exists, just not with you? I didn't lose my son to death. I lost him to distance. And that kind of grief confuses the heart. There was no moment where I could say, this is where it ended. No final conversation. No slammed door. Just a slow unfolding of silence that wrapped itself around my days. I began mourning in secret. I grieved the version of him who used to call just to hear my voice. The one who shared his worries before they became problems. The one who needed me not because he was weak, but because he trusted me. Now, I was learning about his life the way strangers do, from the outside, carefully, without context. I couldn't talk about this grief with anyone. People don't understand mourning someone who hasn't left completely. They say things like, at least he's happy, at least he's alive, at least he hasn't cut you off, at least, as if pain should be measured against worse possibilities. So I kept quiet. I went about my days with a smile practiced enough to feel natural. I answered questions without giving anything away. I told people I was fine, and over time, that became the version of me they accepted. But at night, the truth surfaced. I lay awake thinking about all the things I wanted to tell him. Not accusations, not demands, just memories, just reassurance, just love. I wondered if he ever missed me the way I missed him. If he ever reached for his phone and stopped. If he ever thought of me in moments of joy, or if I only existed in moments of obligation. Those thoughts became a habit, and habits are dangerous when they involve pain. One evening, I caught myself saving a voice message I'd almost sent. I listened to it over and over again, the sound of my own voice soft, careful, trying not to ask for too much. I deleted it. That's when I realized something frightening. I had started censoring my love. I was afraid that expressing it fully might make him pull away even more. Afraid that reminding him of our bond would feel like pressure instead of comfort. So I held it back. And love that's held back long enough starts to hurt the person holding it. I began asking myself questions I never thought I would. Was I too much? Did I ask for too little? Did I matter less now, or was I just no longer convenient? There were moments when I wanted to scream, moments when I wanted to disappear, completely just to see if my absence would be noticed. But mothers don't scream. They endure. They grieve quietly, in ways that don't disrupt the lives they once built around someone else. And in that quiet grief, I came to understand something painful and true. You can miss someone who still exists. You can love someone who no longer reaches for you. And you can grieve a relationship that ended without anyone admitting it was over. That is the loneliest kind of grief. Letting go is often misunderstood. People think it means forgetting. They think it means replacing love with indifference. But that's not what it meant for me. For me, letting go meant learning how to breathe again without holding my heart hostage to someone else's silence. I didn't wake up one morning suddenly healed. There was no dramatic moment of clarity. No decision that changed everything overnight. It happened quietly, in small, almost invisible ways. I stopped checking my phone every few minutes, not because I stopped caring, but because the waiting was teaching my body how to ache. I stopped rereading old messages, hoping to find proof that I was still important. The words never changed, no matter how many times I looked at them. I began to understand that love shouldn't feel like begging for attention from someone you once carried inside your own body. That realization hurt, but it also freed something inside me. I started doing things just for myself. Simple things at first: walking in the evening air, cooking meals I enjoyed, sitting with my own thoughts instead of fighting them. I let the silence exist without trying to fill it. And in that silence, I found a different kind of strength. I realized I could love my son deeply without chasing him. I could hold space for him without shrinking myself. I could accept that his life had grown in directions that no longer revolved around me and still honor the bond we shared. This didn't mean I stopped missing him. I still did. Every milestone I imagined, every small victory of his life, carried a quiet echo of my absence. I still wondered if he knew how often I thought of him. But I stopped punishing myself with those thoughts. Instead of asking, "Why doesn't he call?" I began asking, "How can I live fully even when he doesn't?" That question changed everything. I wrote letters I never sent, not because I hoped he'd read them, but because I needed to say the words. I allowed myself to feel proud of the woman I was becoming in the aftermath of loss. A woman who could love without clinging. A woman who could miss without breaking. A woman who could wait not in desperation, but in dignity. And then, one day, something unexpected happened. I stopped measuring my worth by his attention. I remembered that I was a person before I was a mother, a whole person, a woman with depth, history, resilience. I didn't lose that just because my role in his life changed. If anything, I had to reclaim it. I learned that letting go doesn't mean closing the door. It means standing at the door without begging someone to walk through it. It means trusting that if they return, it will be because they want to, not because you held on so tightly they couldn't escape. And if they don't, you still live, you still love, you still matter. I don't know what the future holds with my son. I don't know if time will soften the distance or make it permanent. But I know this: I will never stop being his mother, and I will never stop being myself. Both truths can exist at the same time if he ever comes back. If one day my phone rings and I see his name again, this is what I'll say, not the words I practiced in anger, not the questions I rehearsed during sleepless nights. Not the pain I carried quietly for years. I'll speak from the place that survived. I'll say, "I missed you," not in a way that blames, not in a way that demands explanation, just the truth, simple, honest, human. Because love doesn't disappear just because silence grows. I'll tell him I never stopped believing in him, even when he stopped reaching out, even when the distance felt permanent. Even when I had to learn how to live without hearing his voice. I won't ask, "Why did you leave me behind?" Because I already know the answer isn't simple. Life pulls people in directions they don't understand until years later. Instead, I'll say, "I hope you found what you were searching for." And I'll mean it, because a mother's love isn't about possession. It's about wanting peace for your child, even when that peace didn't include you. If he apologizes, if he struggles to find words, I'll give him time. Because I know how hard it is to face someone who loved you when you weren't at your best. But I'll also protect the woman I became in his absence. I won't beg him to stay. I won't reshape myself to fit into his life again. I won't erase the growth that came from the pain. I'll welcome him not as the broken version of myself, but as a whole person. And if he never comes back, if this silence is the ending life chose for us, then this is what I want you, whoever is listening tonight, to understand. You are not invisible just because someone stopped calling. You are not replaceable just because your role changed. You are not forgotten just because your love went unanswered. Sometimes, the deepest love stories are the ones that teach us how to stand alone. I learned how to sit with my emotions without drowning in them. I learned how to love without expectation. I learned how to let my heart remain open without bleeding endlessly. And most importantly, I learned this: being a mother doesn't end when the calls stop. Being worthy doesn't end when someone chooses a different life. Being strong doesn't mean you didn't hurt, it means you carried the hurt and kept going. If you're listening to this and you feel forgotten by someone you gave everything to, a child, a partner, a family member, please hear me. Your love mattered. Your presence mattered. Your sacrifices mattered, even if no one ever says thank you. And tonight, as this story ends, I want you to take a deep breath. Put one hand on your chest. You're still here. Your heart still beats. Your story isn't over. Some endings don't close doors. They teach us how to build ourselves a home within. Thank you for listening. If this story touched something inside you, don't keep it silent. Like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe for more late night stories that heal quietly, and most importantly, take care of yourself. Good night.